Welcome, everyone, to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 advisory group. Revolution 250 is a collaboration among about 70 organizations in and around Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the American Revolution. And our guest today is Roberta Descenz0, who is an historian, and her real focus has been on the royal governors of Massachusetts. Roberta, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So your main focus has been on not the last three, but the three important ones, that is Pownall, Bernard, and Hutchinson. So
Correct.
first, how did you get interested in the royal governors?
So actually, it actually all revolves around when I first started working at Old State House back in 2013. I didn't really know much about them, and I went into the job really having the usual very patriotic view of the American Revolution, really enjoying the patriot story. I didn't really have the loyalist story so much.
Mm-hmm.
And when I arrived there, a lot of the other education associates there would always talk about Thomas Hutchinson and how they felt bad for him, which I found very fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So while I was there, I started learning more about Thomas Hutchinson. I realized his story really is kind of interesting, and it's not what I expected. And then one day I had a single tour with somebody. She was taking one of my Boston Massacre tours, and Thomas Hutchinson came up as part of the tour, and she said to me, I bet I can tell you how you feel about your royal governor. And I said, actually, no, I feel very differently about him. And I started talking to her about Thomas Hutchinson, and she left feeling so enlightened that I realized this was a story that needed to be told.
Yeah.
So I started looking more into the royal governors, branching out from Thomas Hutchinson to Bernard, Pownall, all the way back to the first royal governors in 1691, 1692.
Mm-hmm.
And I found them just so fascinating. And I announced that I was going to do one of my special talks on the royal governors, and it just kind of snowballed from there.
Okay, good. And Hutchinson is from Massachusetts, long legacy here. And so in some ways, is his appointment seen as a way of calming things down in the late 1760s, early 1770s?
I do really believe so, and I think he feels his appointment is too, and I think it's part of why he expects the appointment himself. Because he was in politics since 1737, and because his family was a long-established family here in Massachusetts, I think there's this expectation that he will probably know how best to settle the differences between the colonists and the mother country that have really started to occur by the time he becomes governor.
And it doesn't work, we know, for reasons beyond really his control in many ways. But do you think he could have done things differently to prevent the revolution?
I think by the time he becomes royal governor, things are just well too underway. A lot happens under Governor Bernard more than it does Hutchinson. Hutchinson is the governor during many of the events that we do associate with the lead up to the American Revolution, but it's really Bernard that sets the stage.
Yeah.
And by the time Thomas Hutchinson steps in, he's inheriting this situation that's already kind of started to fall apart.
Yeah.
So I think there's not a lot he could have done differently, but there are things that he does because he was in politics for a long time. And I think as lieutenant governor, perhaps under Francis Bernard, when Bernard was governor, he could have done some things differently.
Yeah. And Bernard, he's been governor of New Jersey. And why don't we talk a bit about him? Because he is a character that is really fascinating and really important for the whole story. And he manages to get out before things get really bad.
Right.
So how does he get to be governor? He's not from here, of course. He's
right. So he's actually from England, and he wasn't entirely badly off, but he was more from moderate means personally. He actually became royal governor and tried to become a royal governor, first of New Jersey, then Massachusetts, in the hopes of supporting his large family and growing family that grew to about 10 children.
Wow.
So in New Jersey, he doesn't quite have all 10 children yet, but that family is still growing.
Does the family come with him?
Some do, some don't. Some stay in England. Some actually some come with him to Massachusetts. Some are, to New Jersey.
Yeah.
Some are born in New Jersey, or in the colonies.
Right.
And he realizes in New Jersey that even though he now has this royal governorship, it's not paying well enough. So he applies then to Massachusetts because it's kind of considered a promotion colony. It pays more. So he tries to go to Massachusetts. And then when he comes here, he realizes it's still not enough. So he really struggles with the finances as royal governor and supporting the family. But it is his incentive to be the royal governor.
Yeah. And doesn't William Franklin succeed him in New Jersey? Or am I getting
William Franklin, yeah. So actually, it's the famous story of Benjamin Franklin as well, where he actually disowns his son because of their differences.
Yeah, that's a bit later. Let's see.
Yeah.
So Francis Burnett, he comes here, and then he makes some decisions that are going to widen the political rifts that we see developing.
Yeah, he does. And a lot of them have to do with smuggling and enforcing the new taxes that come in after the French and Indian War, when Great Britain's in a lot of debt. Francis Bernard starts things off pretty badly with with enforcing smuggling regulations. And the reason why he's doing that is the royal governor stood to profit from any seizures of vessels. He actually profit by a third of the seizure. And because, again, he's struggling to support this rather large and growing family, he really starts hammering down on that smuggling because he's trying to, again, find other ways of supporting this family.
But is it just supporting his family, or isn't it also part of upholding the rule of law and the whole idea of the parliament passing laws?
It's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
But I think for him, there is this personal level of it. Is he has this personal reason to do it, because he actually also really liked his smuggled goods too. Anyone who was in the colonies really did. But I think he does have that personal incentive. And actually, he also, before coming to the colonies, was a lawyer. So he does. So some of it is very personal in that he wants to support that family, and some of it is that he is just upholding the laws. He feels he's doing what he needs to do and what is his job. So it's kind of a little mix of both.
Yeah. And do his political enemies make much of the fact that he has a personal interest in stopping them from following their personal interest?
He really comes across to them as a very needy governor. It's part of why they get very upset about what's going on, because they notice he has this personal interest. And there's actually a instance where, in a rushed attempt before he was leaving the colony on a trip to inspect some land that he was gifted by our legislative branch, he actually makes this rushed attempt to seize a vessel, and he makes this private deal with the ship captain. And it really upset not just the colonists, it upsets the actual customs officials as well, because they feel it's weakening their position. So he actually upsets both sides. He doesn't just upset the colonists in an instance like that. It wasn't illegal, it just was frowned upon, basically.
Yeah. You could see someone like Hutchinson in a system where governors are being elected governor of Massachusetts. It's hard to see Bernard having the same political skills, or does he, that I'm missing here? I mean, is it seeking a crown appointment does have a political aspect to it, but you're not really currying favor with a bigger group.
So for him, he actually gets his royal governorship through patronage. He knew the right people, and he knew someone who could pull some strings for him and get him that position. And it's the same with a lot of royal governors, actually. Royal governors, a lot of the time, they came here to be royal governors to enhance their situation back home in England and climb up the ladder there later. That was the case with Thomas Pownall, who came before Francis Bernard. But it really was more a case of, who do you know? And that was what happens with Francis Bernard, is he just knew the right people to get him that position.
Right. Yeah, we're talking with Roberta Descenz0, an historian whose focus is the royal governors of Massachusetts, and we're talking about Francis Bernard, namesake of the town of Bernardston, New Jersey. In fact, they remember him fondly in New Jersey. Now, almost immediately, though, in addition to smuggling, he makes an appointment as Chief Justice that comes to be a political problem, which he thinks is solving a political problem. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So Francis Bernard, when he first comes into office, he actually he notices Massachusetts is very divided along political feuding lines. Massachusetts was unique that it was considered one of the most factious colonies with that. And a position for the Chief Justiceship of our Massachusetts Superior Court opened. And he knew that the two previous governors before him had promised that position to someone very specifically on the side, on one political side of the of Massachusetts party system. This was someone who was a lawyer here in Massachusetts. He was very well known, and he had studied law his entire life. And so he seemed like a perfect fit. And he actually, this is James Otis Sr.
Yeah, he's also the Speaker of the House, I think.
Right. Yeah. And he actually, and his son is also up and coming in politics as well. And he actually wasn't actually expecting the Chief Justiceship necessarily. He just was expecting he'd get a seat on the bench. So even if Bernard had chosen someone that was already on the Massachusetts Superior Court to be the Chief Justice, James Otis was expecting to at least get on the bench. But instead, what Bernard does is he chooses Thomas Hutchinson to take the position of the Chief Justiceship instead. And it creates a bigger issue with the political parties here in Boston because James Otis was on one side, Hutchinson was on another, and the Otises really vent all their anger at their political rival, Thomas Hutchinson. And it creates a huge rift and a huge problem. And Bernard actually wanted to eliminate these parties because he felt they were hindering the government. But when he does this, it creates this sense that he's declaring a side for one of the political parties himself. And it makes it so he can't stay neutral, and it makes it so he can't reach that goal of eliminating the parties.
So does that almost immediately make it impossible for him to govern? And is that something he can recover from just politically?
Not really. It's not really something he can recover from politically. And mostly because the Otises at that point just start having, because the Otises and Hutchinson actually before this had at least amicable relations. I mean, they may not have been on the same side, but they were amicable to each other. And they could come together and make compromises. But after this, they just become so enraged that it drives them to continue that no matter what Bernard or Hutchinson do from that point forward, they just go exactly for whatever stance is going to be the complete opposite.
Wow. That's fascinating. Why don't we talk a little bit about Thomas Pownall, because by your account, he's actually more successful. And he goes on to make proposals for the colonial government that might have averted a crisis, wouldn't have. But so how come he is a more popular and more successful than Bernard is?
Well, Thomas Pownall is interesting. He came in after another popular governor, and he actually didn't expect to be popular himself. He was worried he wouldn't be, because he actually had been involved in having our previous popular royal governor overthrown and having him put in his place.
Well, who was that? Who was the governor he had?
William Shirley.
Okay.
So Pownall actually did not expect to be very popular. He knew he was going to come in, and he was nervous about the dynamic when he came in. And he actually found himself facing a hostile legislative branch who really didn't want to work with him very well. It would push a little against him. But Pownall was a very different governor because he was an explorer in the colonies before he became governor, and it allowed him to learn about the different ways that the colonies were administered and their relationship to the overall government in England. And he kind of started to form his own kind of philosophic view on how the colonial administration worked. And when he steps into office as a royal governor, it's really a little bit like Pownall's experiment, because he comes in with a very open mind about how to run this government. And he's very open-minded about catering to what the colonists wish and standing up to his superiors back home in England who need him to get certain things done here in the colony, and saying, well, that's not how the colony works, though. And that's not something someone usually would say to Great Britain, who is, or to the government back home in Great Britain, who is their superior or boss.
It might be worthwhile, Roberta, just to talk a little bit about, what the role of the governor was supposed to be. I mean, we kind of know today, governors are elected, and in this case, they're not. And we know they're supposed to represent the people who voted for them. So these guys are representing something else. They have kind of a different function than a governor. They're still governing, but what can we talk a little bit about what it is they're supposed to be doing and how well they do it?
So the royal governorship was actually England's way of getting kind of a handle on what the colonists here in Massachusetts were doing. Not every colony had a royal charter, so it's a little different in every colony, but Massachusetts was one of them. And the colonies that had a royal charter, basically the purpose of a royal governor was that he would actually represent the king and parliament back home in Great Britain. He was to stand in as that body that represented their interests. So he's not necessarily representing completely the interests of the people. He does act as a physical connection between the people in the colonies and that political body back home in Great Britain. But his main job is to represent the interests of Great Britain.
Okay. But so then when Pownall is actually trying to present the colonists' case, that's not what he's supposed to be doing.
Not really, no. And it gets his superiors really frustrated with him. So in his first year in office, he is dealing with, again, this very hostile legislative branch who isn't really sure what to make of him. And especially since he ousted Shirley.
Why did we talk about why he ousted Shirley? What poor William Shirley?
He actually was personally slighted by Shirley. He actually, as an adventurer and explorer in the colonies, was getting himself involved in the campaigns, or at least information on the campaigns of the French and Indian War. And there was a meeting in Alexandria, Virginia, that he wanted to attend. And Shirley was, at the time, in charge of that meeting and said, no, I'm not allowing you to attend. You have absolutely no authority in any of this. So there's no reason for you to be here. And it's kind of after that Thomas Pownall starts to have this kind of sour taste in his mouth about Shirley. And he starts working with others who are already feeling a little disaffected with Shirley to get him out of office.
People in Massachusetts or people in England who
in
are
general? Actually, in the French and Indian War campaign, because Shirley actually was for a short time, commander-in-chief of British forces in North America for the French and Indian War. And some people didn't really like that. They didn't like that Shirley actually was from England, but he spent most of his life living in Massachusetts and in the colonies. So they really categorized him as what they would call a provincial. And they didn't really like having this provincial in charge. But also what kind of compounded all that was Shirley had a lot of plans and campaigns in mind as far as Canada, and every time he came up with these grand plans of capturing certain areas, Oswego, Canada, they always fell through. It never really happened. And so people were getting a little disaffected with Shirley because it seems like he wasn't really being effective to them. And it seems like he didn't really have a firm handle on that commander-in-chief position to some people.
Wow. I guess it is easy in these positions to make enemies, whether military, political, so it's fraught. And yes. We're talking with Roberta Descenz0, an historian who focuses on the royal governors of Massachusetts. Now, you mentioned Pownall being an adventurer, explorer, but his first arrival in America is kind of an interesting story, too. And can you tell us a bit more about his background?
Yeah, it's actually a bit of a tragic one. So he struggled, his family struggled financially. So again, he is a bit of a rags to riches story. And as I mentioned a little earlier, he does come here in the hopes of bettering his situation and climbing up the ladder. And he came here in financial straits. He was appointed to be the secretary for a new incoming governor of New York. And when he arrived with that governor in New York, within a week, the governor was actually found in his garden, deceased after a suspected fit of melancholy. And Pownall was left actually trying to figure out what he should do because he didn't have the finances really to return to England.
Actually, Roberta, what is this, a fit of melancholy? I didn't know it was fatal.
So it's basically their way of saying, it's their polite way of saying he had a depressive.
And he took his own life.
Yeah, and he had depression, and he took his own life during one of his bouts with depression, unfortunately.
Wow.
So that's another thing too, is some of these governors that come in, like Thomas Hutchinson, who we've discussed, they also do have, Hutchinson also seemed to struggle with a lot of depression and anxiety, and he's actually very open about it in his letters, where he writes that he always suffered from weak nerves, and he does seem to have his ups and downs too. So we do see that happening in the royal governors, where they do have these moments of self-doubt that maybe we're not privy to.
Yeah.
And this young royal governor came in, and he was, for whatever reason, he felt there was no way out of whatever it was he was facing. And Pownall, of course, being appointed to him as the secretary, found himself in a situation where he had no way of returning back home to England. He didn't have the money, but he also lost his job. Because the governor he was appointed to be a secretary for was now gone. And so he decided the best course of action then was to explore the colonies and see what there was to offer here in the colonies. And it not only introduced him to the colonial administrations and how they all worked and how they all worked differently, but it also introduced him to many famous people here in the colonies as well, including Benjamin Franklin, who was very helpful for Thomas Pownall as well.
Right. And then later on, as you mentioned, Pownall having theories about the colony, a philosophy of governing. And later on, I think he serves as Undersecretary of State for the American colonies, in the years during the late 1760s and into till the time of the outbreak of the Revolution, I believe. So he continues to be involved in thinking about colonial administration long after this tenure. So he starts off tragic story, but then he maintains an interest in the American colonies.
He does. And I think, so when he leaves Massachusetts, he leaves because he wants to kind of continue climbing up that ladder. And he feels that he's kind of done all he can here in Massachusetts. So his next step is to go to England. But there is a part of him that I feel always kind of longed to come back to Massachusetts. It's something he kind of hoped for, that someday he'd get to kind of maybe retire here. But he does make a lot of overtures towards things like maybe becoming Massachusetts agent. During the American lead up to the American Revolution, though, while he shows a lot of interest in what the American colonists are doing, and while he shows them a lot of support, one reason why he doesn't become an agent is he shows a lot of confusion at the riots. Even though he understands the political sentiment that the Patriots have, he gets very confused at the violence that breaks out, and it bars people who would be maybe usually kind of up to having him as that agent from actually voting him in, because they're worried he might just be a little too confused and
What do you
out
mean?
of.
Well, now, what do you mean by confused? He doesn't understand them, or he's
Yeah, he
on the
doesn't
wrong
really
side?
understand them. He's very shocked and taken aback.
Mm-hmm.
So even though he sides with the patriot sentiment more so than most royal governors really would,
Mm-hmm.
he has moments where all of a sudden he's like, but wait, why are we rioting? We can't be doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually writes to them saying things like, I'm on your side, but please don't ruin your cause with this radical like movement.
Right.
So some of that confusion and that being taken aback does kind of, I think, hinder him from being an agent, but he wants to be, and he thinks he would make a good agent because he knows the colonists. He knows that he could be a very good in-between.
Right.
And he knows how to speak to them. He knows that they like him. And under Bernard's administration, when things really start hitting the fan, actually the colonists start talking about how they wish they could have Governor Pownall back, that they wish they could go back to those days of Governor Pownall being in office.
Right. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So he keeps thinking he'll have a good following that would allow him to become agent, but it never actually happened.
Mm-hmm. So the agent's appointed by the assembly, and the governor is sometimes on the other side. I mean, that's kind of one of these.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking he helped oust Shirley. So I'm wondering then, is he helping or hindering Bernard and Hutchinson when they're governors, and he's in a position to influence things in London?
So, and I feel like this is an unwritten rule with royal governors, is I found that royal governors, regardless of how much they agree with each other, there's an unwritten rule that they also have to be disagreeing with each other. But during this lead up to the American War for Independence and during all the upheaval, Pownall starts correspondence with Bernard and Hutchinson, trying to figure out what's going on. And it's actually very friendly correspondence. He's trying to discern from them what exactly is happening, what they are trying to do to resolve what is happening. That way he can go to Parliament, because at this time, he's now in the House of Commons. And he can take that information and start trying to help the colonists with that information. And it is a friendly correspondence, but we find that when the governors, when Pownall, Bernard, and Hutchinson all end up in England, Bernard and Hutchinson are not friends with Pownall, but Bernard and Hutchinson themselves do form a closer friendship together. And even though they actually disagreed with each other a lot here in the colony as governor and lieutenant governor, it makes it even more interesting that they kind of come together and form that close friendship afterwards.
Interesting. So what does Bernard do after he leaves Massachusetts?
So he actually tries to help the British ministry, telling his point of view and side of the story. There's actually a hearing, and the British ministry kind of goes back and forth with him. When he's governor, they look at some of the things he's saying and some of the things he's writing, and they applaud it. And there's actually an instance where some of his letters are actually released to Parliament without Bernard's knowledge. And Bernard says, well, I'm glad that they really liked what I said, but I wasn't intending for those letters to be public. But then later, we see a change in the wind, so to speak, where they start saying, what is Bernard doing? And they start actually kind of feeling like what Bernard's doing is not the correct thing. So it goes back and forth. When he goes to England, they feel he's very valuable in helping them try to figure out what's going on. So he does help a little bit, and he does give his 2 cents, so to speak, of what he experienced and what he thinks should happen. And he actually also is there encouraging that Thomas Hutchinson should succeed him. But one thing that kind of embarrasses Bernard is, again, Thomas Hutchinson did have moments of self-doubt, and Thomas Hutchinson does write a letter resigning his office before he even gets the governorship.
Wow.
And that makes Bernard feel a little like, hey, but I've been rooting for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Bernard does do that. But unfortunately for Bernard, he doesn't really get to have much time before he starts suffering from some health issues of his own. He suffers a stroke in 1771, which results in he becomes very physically disabled. But in addition, he suffers regular seizures, and eventually one of those seizures results in him passing away as well in 1779.
Oh, wow. Okay. We were talking with Roberta Descenz0, historian, whose focus is on the royal governors of Massachusetts. And, Thomas Hutchinson, letters, Thomas Hutchinson, his real undoing comes because of letters. I wonder if you want to tell us that whole story of that episode.
Sure. So there is actually two episodes of letters being leaked. One when Bernard is here, called the Bernard Letter Affair, and it's the lesser known affair. Bernard wrote a lot of panicked letters to the British ministry about what was going on here in Boston, in Massachusetts and Boston. And someone gets a hold of those letters and sends them to the Patriot Party here in Massachusetts, and they have them published. Now, that kind of was something that should have signaled to the royal governors that their correspondence was not as private and secure as they thought.
Right.
And you do see actually Thomas Hutchinson writing in a lot of his letters, and vice versa, his friends writing to him, burn this letter, or please keep what I'm writing secret.
But the fact that we know about these means they weren't burning them or keeping them secret.
Right, exactly. And he's actually accused Thomas Hutchinson of being a very secretive person. He was a very private person. But you do see in his letters people writing him that because they're worried about reprisals if their letters are found, and vice versa. So we do see a lot of that going on. But what happens to Thomas Hutchinson is there's some letters leaked of his own in 1773. And again, as a royal governor who's already seen what happened to Bernard, he should have already known that his correspondence was not as secure. But the letters that are leaked, or interestingly enough, are actually letters that he wrote before the Bernard Letter Affair. They're actually from all the way back in 1769. And the content of the letters are actually pretty damaging because they do say some things that the Patriots already knew he was saying, but it has it now on paper. So now there's a way to actually publish it for the people to see without there being any question that he actually said it. But another thing too that's damaging about it is the letters that he was writing. If we look at the context of the broad spectrum of letters he was writing at that time in 1769, his house had already been ransacked in 1765. He was suffering from a lot of anxiety about the political rioting that had occurred and that he might be again a target of these riots. And there comes a point in 1769 where I feel there's been some steady correlation where he's not really been on board with Bernard's ideas of maybe we should really hammer down on the colonists, have these soldiers here. He doesn't seem completely on board with it right off the bat, but it seems like after his house is ransacked and he has all of this anxiety, he starts to feel like, well, maybe Bernard is right. Maybe the only way to stop this is to have the soldiers come, is to hammer down on our liberties. And in the letters, we start to see those sentiments coming out. It seems like this correlation of frustration that's kind of built up to a climax coming out in those letters. And he says actually in them that he feels agonized about what to do. And I think he feels agonized because he wants to do what's best for the people. He's worried what's best for the people is unfortunately going to be some harsh action. And he doesn't want to see that, but he's starting to come to this reluctant realization it might be what needs to happen. And the letters published out of that broader context sound very damaging because of the fact that it really is just saying like, well, we might need those soldiers now, or we might have to give up some of our liberties at this point to do this. And when you see just that without the broader context, of course, that's going to make people really upset. It's going to make things worse. And Thomas Hutchinson knows, as soon as he's told that these letters were found and that they were published, he knows that that's the end. He basically knows after that there is no way he's going to be able to recover any hold he had on the situation.
Wow. So how do these letters come to become public?
So actually, Benjamin Franklin somehow, back in England, somehow gets his hands on these letters, and he gives them to someone who then sends them to the colonists.
Wow.
So it's through Benjamin Franklin, really in England, working on the colonists' behalf. He finds these letters, and he actually says, forward them along, and that's what he does. He forwards them here to the colonies. And of course, that's going to be a big victory for the Patriots at this point, who have at this point been saying for years, Thomas Hutchinson is not on our side. He's like Bernard, trying to tear us down. And certainly the letters sound like that's exactly what he's doing.
Right. We've been talking with Roberta Descenz0, an historian of the royal governors. And do you think, is there a way, Hutchinson sees this is the end once the letters are published?
Yeah.
And they're published by the Assembly, I believe, who see this is important because we've been fighting this guy for years and now we have the proof and here it is. So what does he do after this?
He just, when he starts actually writing to his friends and correspondents, and he actually writes about it, and he already, in a sense, so he was already struggling with a little self-doubt. And I think that's something that we don't really see a lot with Thomas Hutchinson. We think of him as someone who was always very, very confident in himself, never seemed to have any self-doubt. And he's presented as someone who is so self-confident to the point of even maybe being egotistically self-confident. But he does actually have a lot of doubt. And we do start to see this coming forward when he becomes governor. It's part of why he sent a resignation letter before he got his commission. But honestly, that self-doubt was, I feel like, more his way of trying to manipulate the system of, hey, do you really want me as governor or not? Because if you don't want me as governor, I might as well just resign.
Wow.
And so I think his resignation was really a little bit more of that kind of sentiment than it was a sincere sentiment. But he does have this self-doubt. And when his letters are published, we really see his self-confidence in his position just plummet entirely. And he does actually start to inwardly feel that it's the time is the right time to say, it's all given up. Like, there's not really much more I can do. And it's part of the reason why after the Boston Tea Party in 1773, he does actually go to Great Britain in June of 1774 and has General Gage come in and take the governorship over from him.
Yeah. Wow. So then he spends the rest of his life in England.
Yeah.
Wow. It's interesting. Now, where do you get what if someone wanted to read more of Hutchinson's letters, Bernard's letters, where would they go?
So actually, I read some of Thomas Hutchinson's letters. I've been able to get them. Actually, there's actually some volumes of his letters that you can get published, which is really easily accessible. His letters, though, he wrote so many letters.
Yeah.
He wrote drafts of letters, and it was very detailed. So really, the books are really great if you don't have the ability to go to historical societies. I know the Mass Historical Society definitely has a lot of documents of Thomas Hutchinson's and his sons.
Yeah.
But that's one place you can go. His personal diary, which was published posthumously in 2 volumes, that he wrote after he moved to England, you can actually get for free on Google Books now. So there are ways to access it. That, however, I believe it's his grandson or great-grandson who publishes it. He did kind of abridge a little bit of it to keep it focused more on a specific aspect. So for someone, if they were looking for me, for example, one of the things I find really fascinating is the tragedy he faced in England, being homesick. And he and he had very personal family tragedies as well in England. For someone like me who's interested in learning more about that source can be a little difficult because that is exactly what his descendant actually abridged. So you get a little bit less of the personal aspect than I personally like to try to get into. But the sources are available. Some of them are very easily accessible online, some not so much.
I believe the Colonial Society has also been digitizing their volumes of the Hutchinson and Bernard papers. So this is good. And okay, so we've been talking with Roberta Descenz0, historian focusing on the royal governors. And do you have a favorite royal governor?
So I was asked that at Old State House. Someone actually asked me, they said, do you have a favorite, or are they all like your children? You can't pick one. But I think it's pretty clear that I do have one that I tend to like to focus on most, and that is, for me, I feel Thomas Hutchinson. He is the original one that got me interested in the royal governors, and his story is very, when you look at his story both politically and combine it with the tragedies of his personal life and why he was the way he was, I feel like it makes him a very relatable character. And I feel like he's someone that is very interesting to learn about because he was so complex. He wasn't just simple bad guy versus good guy. He did good things. He also did bad things. He's a perfect example of someone who really simply was just another human being. And yet he still aspired to and actually even succeeded in making it to the highest position in the colony. And I think that can be both inspiring, and it can be also just what is so touching about the tragedy of his tale as well.
It is a very isolating position, being a royal governor.
Yeah.
So thank you. Well, thank you, Roberta. It's been fun talking to you about the royal governors, and so thank you for joining us. And
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, and I also want to thank our listeners. Since we've started this, we've had people tuning in on every continent, 75 different countries, over 2,100 cities, and I just want to acknowledge some of our listeners today, here in Boston, of course, and in Hanover, Massachusetts, Mishawaka, Indiana, Germantown, Maryland, Berlin, New Jersey, as well as Frankfurt in Hesse, and in Valonia, Arkansas, Fredericksburg, Virginia, and all the points in between. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to talking to you again. And I will now have Jonathan pipe us out on the road to Boston.